Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this year's BSR ICS joint lecture. We do one of these every year, partly to emphasise all the intellectual and research connections between us, but also because we like each other and we get along quite well and we have some common interests. BSR, of course, has a huge range of interests. There's almost no subject that isn't studied within the BSR at the moment: anthropology, art history, theology, Italian literature, you name it, and occasionally the Renaissance. To do the Renaissance well, you have to know about what came before the Renaissance, what was being reborn, and what was being reborn with the classical. So welcome to each of the classical studies. So that's the rationale behind all of this. The British Research Institutes overseas, Institutes of Research, what are now called the BIRI Institutes, our schools in Athens and Rome and Ankara and so on, are an important part of the research ecosystem, as we say these days. They're absolutely vital to sustain not just the work of Brits overseas, but also to be a kind of scaffolding across which a network of relationships and collaborations, which is sometimes students moving back and forth, sometimes scholars, sometimes collective projects. And these are all of them based around this various seats just in the middle there. And this network of schools and institutes is a really vital way that connects us to our colleagues elsewhere in Europe and in the Near East and in Africa. And as we manage haplessly to separate ourselves from Europe through gross acts of incompetence, which this week is going to include the eradication of the Erasmus scheme, and who knows what's next, a small line of bricks across the Eurostar tunnel, I've no idea. As the politicians begin to take all this stuff to bits, it's even more important that cultural and intellectual and research activities survive. And that's why I think the links between British institutions and British institutions overseas are so vital, as we're keeping those lines of communication open until happier and saner times prevail. It's a really great pleasure to have representing the school itself here with us, including the director. Welcome, Stephen. Nice to have you with us once again. But we're also particularly here, of course, to hear tonight's lecture from Gabriel Zuchtriegel, who is the director at the Museum and Archaeological Park at Paestum. Gabriel is a graduate of the Humboldt University, at Bonn University, has also worked in universities in Italy, worked in Pompeii, and in a rational world, I would now already have in my hands his recently appeared book on colonialism and subalternity to wave at you and point out what a good Easter present this would be for your friends. It promises to be a reworking of our understanding of 5th and 4th century colonies in Italy, with implications for elsewhere, a view that is from the bottom up, a view of non-elite experiences of ancient colonial landscapes. And I was about to say that you can set alongside, and I realised that actually not very much you could set it alongside, because it really is there on the cutting edge. But that rational world hasn't meant I've actually got a copy in my hand, and the library hasn't accessioned it yet, so I just have to make you imagine this wonderful book that I expected just up the road in Waterstones, but I didn't get a chance to run and dash. But it looks an absolutely wonderful project. We're not going to hear a summary of the book today. What instead Gabriel is going to do is to tell us about the park and the museum which he now directs at Paestum, and to tell us in particular about new excavations and scientific analysis, telling us about a Greek city in Italy. We're very glad indeed to have you with us. Welcome, Gabriel. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you all for coming. It's so great to be here, and I'm really honored. I hope I'll be. Do you hear? No lights. Okay, no, I thought light. Okay. I hope I'll be all'altezza, as we say. So, Greg was alluding to the Brexit. And this, of course, has...
But the lights aren't going out all over London.
And this, of course, has nothing to do with the topic of my talk, but Maybe in a way it does, because if you think of it, the way in which we are telling the history of Greek colonization is traditionally one of encounters between the Greeks and the others, the Greeks and the indigenous. And what I would like to try, to do this evening is to tell the history of a certain period in this colonial city of Paestum from a slightly different perspective. So the focus is on the social history of the Greek colony, which I think is very important and has been mostly obscured and marginalized in this tradition from more or less after the Second World War. This becomes very important in our field. The critique also of this Greek indigenous hybridization, how do these two groups interact, and if you focus on this all the time, other topics risk being overlooked. And I think it's very important to understand also colonization, to look at what is happening inside these communities. And what I will speak of tonight is an attempt to do this for a specific period, which is the late archaic time in Paestum. So this would be the late 6th and early 5th century BC, which is a very stimulating and important period in this city. But before getting there, I would like to give you a more general picture. The site of Paestum is, of course, known first and foremost for the temples, the 3 Doric temples, which have so miraculously survived, and which were then had a great impact on European culture from the 18th century onward. We see here this Kniep drawing, the idea that in the middle of nature, mountains, and a very archaic landscape, there's this kind of rediscovery of Greek archaic and classical architecture, which was largely unknown at the time. People had an idea of antiquity that was based on Roman antiquities. And so the site is, of course, still today characterized by the presence of these buildings. Then excavations started in the area, and so apart from the temples we know also other things, but the temples are basically date from the 6th and to 5th century BC. The oldest one is the so-called basilica, which is called in this manner because we do not know yet to what divinity was dedicated, and it was probably started around 560 and then took a few decades until it was finished. And you see here a reconstruction drawing by Dieter Mertens of this extraordinary building with 9 columns on the front side, very richly decorated roof, terracotta roof. Then after that, the Temple of Athena around 500 BC, the only one where we know that it belonged to this goddess, Athena. Combines the Doric with the Ionic order, very interesting also for other architectural details. And then the last one in the chronological order is that so-called Temple of Neptune. Maybe the Temple of Hera has been hypothesized, or Apollo, Zeus maybe, so we are still discussing on that. So this is, of course, what Paestum is famous for, and where still new research is going on, also for all the aspects of the conservation of these buildings, which is not easy, as you can imagine. But then there are other sectors, other fields where we have a good deal of information. The city walls, one of the best preserved fortifications of Magna Graecia, which is almost 5 kilometers long, and then outside the walls, the necropolis, the tombs, the urban cemeteries, which are distributed around the city, as usually the case, and there are several periods, several also types of organization. You see here this very interesting cemetery of the 5th century BC from Sancta Venera, which would be south of the site, where you have this almost egalitarian, very special kind of organization. Others are organized as nuclei, family groups, probably. And so this is another aspect we know quite well of Paestum. Then there has been a big project for many years on the agora, on the public spaces. The Roman Forum, and of course the ancient Greek agora, which is beneath the Roman Forum, with quite spectacular discoveries like the Ecclesiasterion. It's one of the few cases where we know the space where the assembly met, and we have the physical remains of this structure. And beyond that, we know also quite a few things about the urban organization of the city. So we have the temples, the public spaces, the fortifications, but we have also a rough idea of how the city looked in the classical period, thanks also to air photography and excavations in various areas, especially on the roads, on the public roads, which formed this kind of typical colonial grid, which you see here. But there's certainly one big lacuna in our knowledge of the site, because the houses, the remains of houses which you see here around the temples, this is the museum by the way, are all dating from the Roman period. So the Republican 3rd century BC, when Paestum was transformed into a Roman colony, until the imperial period, and it was then definitely abandoned in the early Middle Ages. So we know how these people built temples, the Greek colonists, how they buried their dead, how they held their assemblies, but we don't know how they lived, how the houses looked, where these people lived. So the Archaeological Park of Paestum started 3 years ago. We started a new project of excavations under the Roman structures, and we did start in this area here, which is one of the insulae, the blocks that go back in their organization to the Greek period, to around 500 BC, but that then were overbuilt in the Roman period. And so we decided to excavate in this area to look what's beneath the Roman buildings, which is of course not so easy, because we can't just remove the Roman structures, of course. So we have this situation here. You have the Temple of Neptune and the sanctuary here. One of these blocks divides the excavation area from the sanctuary, and then here this is behind this wall here would be the street, and this is one of the Roman houses, which is very typical house with an atrium and the typical Roman ground plan, and we are excavating in this area. We knew already that there were older remains that had been described in the 1960s, but there was no stratigraphy, no documentation, and so we started by researching these older structures and then enlarged the excavation. And it's a structure which is built entirely out of big, well-dressed stone blocks, as you see here. These are various excavation trenches, and which goes also, runs beneath the later Roman, I say Roman, of course, as a chronological term here, the imperial wall. So it was aligned with the limit of this house toward the street, and you see it goes down quite a bit, up to 5 levels of blocks we found, and also other kinds of foundation structures, a canal running under the wall. So quite a monumental structure. And we were really lucky to find also in various points stratigraphy related to these structures, which is not, which could not be counted on, because we have not only the modern reworking of the area, restorations, excavations 50, 100 years ago. We don't know what they really did and how deep they excavated. But obviously also in antiquity already this had all been reworked and remanaged various times. But you see here there's a series of floor levels, and in various points you could relate them to the structure in blocks, in stone blocks, which I have shown you. And this is some of the materials that came from these layers. It's it's not very spectacular, but it gives a good dating for the structure, and it also gives some indications of what people did in this area. So it's mainly pottery from household pottery, some imported pottery also, and it goes from the late 6th century when this structure was built down to the middle of the 5th, when we have a break because then something happens. It probably was in use even longer, but later buildings then destroyed part of the older stratigraphy. So we have this quite interesting picture. You see here in grey the structure as we found it and partly reconstructed it. So we have a wall running under the Roman wall towards the street, which is here. Then a long wall, which is probably the limit of this structure. 2 or 3 rooms that open to the south, which is here. And then we have here two kind of tunnels where we suppose that there was a kind of a portico or so, supported by these foundations or something in front of these rooms. And to the south, we don't know, we can't excavate this area because there are Roman floors and walls, so there's no way at the moment to look what was there. Maybe a courtyard or an open area, that would be reasonable to expect. So what kind of gave us to think is of course the technique of this structure. We wanted to find the Greek houses, right? And we found this monumental structure, and actually many of our colleagues and friends came to the excavation and said, no, this must be a sanctuary, this must be something, a public hestiatorion, to a banquet hall, something like that. Because it's very unusual that you have such monumental structures. Usually the houses of this period are made of pebble walls, foundations, and then mud brick walls for the most part of the building. And this is what we find in places like in Paestum. There's one other piece of a Greek house, and it's a piece of just pebble walls put directly on the ground. And here we have 5 levels of blocks going down a very, very solid foundation. So we were trying to figure out what was this. Was it really a house, or did we find something else? As you know, it's quite frequent that you certainly look for something and you find something completely different. But we think it's actually, it is a house, a living house, for several reasons. One is that it's perfectly integrated in this Greek insula block. You see here in black the structure I have described to you, and this is in this insula here, and you see it perfectly fits into the larger structure, not only because the wall here runs beneath the Roman wall, but also because it arrives just at the middle. And this is usually what we get in these Greek cities, that you have 2 rows of houses forming a block. The other reason is that the ground plan roughly reminds of other Greek houses of this period, the so-called pastas house. So you have a series of rooms opening to a larger ambiente room, whatever, that then opens to a courtyard. This is Selinunte, this is Naxos on Sicily, and so this could be a model for our structure. We then decided to enlarge the area, to widen the area of excavation, and did this last year. This is the structure we excavated first, and so we went to the north, not being able to go southward, and excavated this area. And we're not yet in the early levels, but what we have found seems to corroborate this view, because we found another structure, this time in the traditional, what we would expect, a very a pebble wall structure, or made of stones, and then the upgoing was in probably in mud bricks. And but it's interesting because we have this, what we call the ambitus, right? The space between 2 houses, and so it really looks like a living quarter, where you have a series of houses, oikopeda, as the Greeks said. So lots where people could build their houses, and they have a roughly standardized shape and form, and this seems to continue in the north area of the house. So as I said, of course, it's usually a technique that you would expect more in public buildings, temples, but also other structures like the so-called Heroon on the Agora of Paestum, which dates to the same time and is a symbolic tomb. So there was not a body in it, but it's probably the symbolic tomb of the founder of the city, which is the only person that can have a tomb inside the city. So we have this on the Agora, this monument. But on the other hand, if you look a bit, you will find some examples where this kind of building technique is also deployed for private houses. And one of the most striking examples is certainly Selinunte on Sicily, where you have entire blocks on the so-called Acropolis, so near the main sanctuary, built of stone blocks, houses, living houses. And in some cases, they were later included in the city, in the fortification. And so we know that they had two stores, right? 2 stories, entirely made of stone blocks. And you can reconstruct them, because some have collapsed and you see them still there, with doors and windows all made in this very, very solid manner. So the question that was asked already, and it dates to the 5th century BC, so it's not so far from Paestum. The question is, of course, how can we explain this, especially in Selinunte, because there what you get is these houses built jointly together. So there must have been a big building project, and the question is, how does this domestic, seemingly private architecture relate to the public? And Roland Martin has spent some thoughts on this in the 1970s already, and he said this is probably seems some kind of half-public buildings or residences of clan, chef de clan, or very wealthy and powerful families. So the idea is here that there's a link between this ruling class of the city, who were also commissioners and actually the heads of the city on the one hand. On the other, they also built special houses for themselves, and this would somehow explain this similarity. But it's only an illusion, an idea. And so what we tried to do in Paestum is to look a bit more into this. And to do this, I will make a little detour, but you will see at the end that it provides new insight also into the topic I started with. And it's the tomb of the diver, which is the most famous piece of our museum. A very special tomb that was excavated 50 years ago south of Paestum. It's special for a series of reasons. It's the only tomb with figurative scenes from this period. It has this scenes of a symposium in it, but even more special is the diver himself. What does it mean? We organized an exhibition on that last year, and we had a conference. We were 3 days talking about the diver, and it wasn't boring. So so there's really a lot to say about this possible, mysteric meaning of the painting. Is it Orphic or Pythagorean or whatever? So there's still a big discussion going on that. And so we also decided to do new research on the tomb of the diver, with on the one hand studying other tombs of the period, and on the other carrying out archaeometric analysis. And this really gives a new perspective, because what has been slightly, I think, undervalued in the past is the fact that there are other painted tombs from this period. They do not have figured scenes, but they have more or less the same scheme, like the tomb of the diver. And one of them, you see them here in the this map. This is Paestum with the various necropolis, and you'd have the red ones are the ones that are painted with this very similar pattern. So you have a red baseboard and a white panel, and in some cases even the lid is painted too, which is another peculiarity about the tomb of the diver. The fact that the lid is painted, which is very unusual also in other areas where you have painted tombs like Etruria or so. The lid is painted. And the other ones are just white plaster. But this is also very frequent in this period. And it goes down from the late 6th century, so this is even earlier than the tomb of the diver, down to the end of the 5th century, when you get then the so-called Lucanian tombs, the other painted tombs, which belong to the 4th century. So there seems to be quite a continuous tradition. And the oldest one of the really very interesting, is this one. We called it the Tomb of the Palmettas. It was excavated some years ago, and it has this painted lid, which has the same frame as the Tomb of the Diver, with the palmettas in the angles. So only the diver is missing. So it seems like the one moment later someone would arrive and paint the diver. But it actually was finished. It was a closed complex, and it's also dated by pottery which was found on top of it. Belonged to one of the urban necropolis, where it was found in the middle of this strange recint which was formed by a canal dug into the rock. And you see it here during the excavation. The pottery was on top of it, Athenian imported pottery. So this would be this here. And another interesting fact is that we had the skeleton was analyzed, and it belongs to a young woman, about 20 years old. So this one has to know that in the case of the diver, this seemingly special tomb has given rise to the idea that it was someone from outside, an Etruscan or Italic, who came to Paestum and was buried according to his own traditions. Because we know that the Etruscans had painted tombs already in the 6th century BC, and so the idea was this was someone from another community who just incidentally died in Paestum and had this special burial. But if you have a similar tomb here, which belongs to a young woman, this suggests that we have really a local phenomenon here, local elite culture. And this is also confirmed by other painted tombs. As I said, through the whole 5th century BC, this is, for example, Gaudo necropolis. Also the lid in this case has this red frame, no palmettas, but it's all white plaster, and then you have the red frame, and on the walls you have this familiar pattern with the baseboard and the white panel. There's also tombs then towards the late 5th century with the kind of a ridge roof, as then becomes common in the 4th century. So there's really a continuity to these 4th century so-called Lucanian tombs. When these are also with typical scenes, but it's a different world. It's really a different thing. There's a whole discussion. Elena knows about this. The Lucanians coming to Paestum. Was it? Did they conquer the city, or were they integrated, or were there no Lucanians at all, and the Greeks were turning Lucanian to some point? But anyway, we have these new tradition of painting, but the techniques and the main pattern is basically the same as in the 5th century. So this is again the tomb of the Palmettas with the skeleton of the young woman. And what I would like to stress here is that this pattern of decorating tombs in this manner clearly reminds of wall decorations of the so-called structural style. The earliest examples we know are from the late 5th, early 4th century BC, from Olynthus in northern Greece. And you have the same patterns here. You have either baseboard and then a panel, or walls entirely painted in red, which is something we find also in Paestum in this period. So tombs painted entirely in red. So in a way, the tomb paintings from Paestum seem to anticipate this. What we find then in the late 5th century in houses. You see here, this is one of these tombs painted in red, and the others, as I said, with this familiar pattern. There's another very early example of this way of decorating the houses from so-called indigenous local site in Sicily, Monte Jato, where one of the rooms of this late 6th, early 5th century building, which was the one where the banquet was celebrated, was entirely painted in red. And the Austrian colleagues have found the pieces of this house cracked down or collapsed on the floor ground with the pottery, which is all the banqueting pottery, of course. So this is interesting also for another reason. I quoted the example of Olynthus, and there the American excavators observed that it's almost, in all cases, the andrones, so the banquet rooms that are decorated in this manner. There are also other rooms painted occasionally, but it's usually, if there's one room that is painted with colored walls, it's the banquet room. And this really is an interesting perspective if you think that the tomb of the diver has a banquet on its walls, because it suggests in a way that the tomb itself is a representation of the banquet hall. This might be an interesting idea to develop. Of course, then you have to cope with the fact that in some of these tombs there are women, young women buried. So it also made me think, but I don't want to go into detail on this now. We usually say, well, the Greek banquet is only for men, and in fact here there are only men. There's only one girl playing the flute. So all the women we see in these representations are either some kind of entertainers or prostitutes. But how does this really apply to a colonial context like Paestum? Because the sources are basically written sources from later periods and pottery from Athens. And there's this kind of a circular argument, because if you say all women we see are not really participants, then all women we see, of course, are not participants. And so I started thinking about this too. But the point here is we tried then to find out, can we have some additional information on the relation between the tombs and the houses in terms of probably production and techniques, material data. And we started a project together with the Associazione Italiana di Archaeometria on the tomb of the diver and other tombs of this period. And this is some of the methods we used, and So it's non-invasive and partly also invasive. And this is one of the results, which is an analysis of the colors through multispectral analysis. And I'll try to explain it to you. You see several groups of tombs. You have here the tomb of the diver, the tuffatore, the palmete, and others. And then this develops in a way, so you see a change, and it corresponds to the chronological development of these tombs. So these here would be the oldest one, the tomb of the diver and the palmetas, and then this here would be the younger ones. So it goes down to the so-called Lucanian tombs, the earliest ones. And this shows one thing, that there is actually a local tradition of tomb painting, which goes down through the whole 5th century, and the tomb of the diver is really part of this. So it's a part of the local production, and you see it also in the sezioni sottili. How do you call that in thin sections? Fine sections, right? But we try to enlarge this also, to go beyond this. Unfortunately, we have no plaster in the houses. It would be very interesting to see what's the relation. Was it the same technique, the same materials? But what we do have is the temples, right? The temples were not in marble, but they were in local travertine, and they were, of course, covered with a plaster, a stucco layer, to make them seem like they were white marble, and then they were partly colored. As we know, there still remains to be seen on the temples. So this is the tomb of the diver, and this is one of the temples where you can see the remains of these stucco layers. And it's really, if you look at it, it's the same thing. It's travertine, like the tombs, then a layer of plaster, and then a fine layer of plaster, and then on top of that you have the painting. So we tried to, we took some samples also from the temples, which is not so easy as you might think, because they were restorated. Also in the Roman period, they were continued to be in use, and so the sample you take might not be the original plaster from the first period, but there might be other layers on top of it from later periods. So we try to figure this out, and what you see here is several samples where you have tombs and temples. The Basilica and the Neptune temple should be there. So what we found out so far is that it's really similar, not only if you look at it, but also if you make scientific analysis. So the idea is that the model, because how to explain this, there's another fact we should keep in mind. I showed you these painted tombs, and you saw the numbers also. Compared to the tombs we know from this period, in general, it's really a very small number. It's less than 1%. So we have a large number of normal tombs, like we find them in many other Greek cities. Fossa tombs and tombs dug into the rock, just simple holes in the ground. And then we have a very small number of painted tombs. And so if you don't want to explain this by Etruscans coming by once in a while and making these strange tombs, you have to have some kind of explanation. And it cannot be that there was a workshop specialized in tomb painting, because the numbers are so low. if you have every 10 years, even every 5 years, even every year, one person being buried in a painted tomb, you can't make a living on that, right? So what were these people doing? And the idea is, based also on this analysis, that the real thing, the real kind of business of these people were the temples. Because as I showed you, there were 3 big temples, but there were others in the Cora, in the territory. Sometimes they were building 2 at a time. The Temple of Athena, and at the same time the Temple of Hera on the river Sele to the north of the city. So we can imagine that from around the middle of the 6th century BC to the middle of the 5th century BC, the city of Paestum was basically a huge construction site. They finished one temple and they moved to the next, and they were working on several projects at a time. And it all was finished with the painters and plasterers who made this last step. And so the idea would be, these are the same people who then occasionally go to the tombs and paint with the same techniques, the same materials, make these special tombs. And maybe also houses, because the model, which is you have these artisans, these craftsmen attracted by the huge construction size, by the temples, and then they work for the local ruling elite for building these tombs, might also work for the houses, right? So the model behind this is that you have in this period, we don't have to think of this like classical Athens, right, where you have the building of the Parthenon or so. There you have the accounts written in inscriptions, and it's the polis, it's the city that organizes and actually pays all the salaries and so. In this period, it's still different, and also even in Athens, down to the early 5th century, the model was a different one. The city, as an institution, was not yet ready to support such huge building projects. There was no money. When they started building the basilica, they had not yet coined money, right? So they had not the administrative. This is only one example. They didn't have the administration capacities as a city to manage all these huge construction sites. So what happened was basically that wealthy families were in charge of these kind of activities. And this was also the case in Athens, where Themistocles had a temple built next to his house of Artemis. And it was a public building. And the story told by Plutarch, which of course you'd say, no, it's much later, but probably there's some truth in it. It makes you understand that he decided basically everything. How to build the temple, what to put inside. So he had his own portrait put inside, which then created problems. But the problem was not the fact per se that he was as a private person had this temple built. So I think the same model works for Paestum. We have to imagine, in other words, that there's a group of wealthy families who are effectively in charge of the city. This is all the archaic discussions, right, in Athens and other places. The contrast between the rich and the people, right, the demos. And this could somehow explain what we have seen. So we have, on the one hand, the public architecture which is controlled by this elite. And they use the same craftsmen, the same artisans, which were maybe even housed by them. They offered, they couldn't give them just money. It didn't work like today. You work and then you make an invoice to the city, but they worked there and they were given housing and free what do you say, lodging and hospitality. And then, you know, at the end they were given something special, like a metal objects or so. Oh, at some point also coins, of course. And the same persons eventually made these special tombs, and probably also might have been responsible for building these special houses. So this is the model which I would like to suggest you. It's of course still going on, our research, and this is only kind of a snapshot from what we're doing. But I think it gives might open a new perspective on the way we think about these cities. Also because there's a very strong tradition. It's a bit fault of the Germans, the Höpfner, Schwandner, the idea of this egalitarian colonies. And certainly it changed over the time, this is clear, but what happens in an early period in such a colony, we're a few decades after the foundation. This is the earliest buildings we have right now. So how do we have to imagine the evolvement of this community who come there? And it's true, there is probably some kind of egalitarian ideology, especially in the 5th century. But at the same time, there's a whole series of dynamics inside these communities, where the interaction with others, like so non-Greeks, indigenous, other Greek cities, becomes a means of conquering, of gaining symbolic or also material capital inside these communities. Thank you for the attention.